Tonight, we're not going to talk about famous wars or loud kings or dramatic betrayals. Instead, we're going to explore something much quieter. Mistakes that happened so slowly, so gently, that no one noticed them at the time. In the medieval world, people believed they understood how time worked, how the body worked, how the world itself was arranged. And most days, life went on just fine. The bells rang, the candles burned low, the nights stayed long. But hidden inside ordinary routines were small misunderstandings, copied by scribes, repeated by teachers, trusted simply because they had always been trusted. Maps that were slightly wrong, calendars that slowly drifted, beliefs that felt comforting even when they weren't quite true. No panic followed these errors. No alarm sounded. They didn't break the world. They simply settled into it like dust on stone. And that's what makes them so fascinating. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were invisible. So tonight, as you rest, let's drift back into a medieval world that felt certain, stable, and calm, and gently uncover the quiet mistakes that shaped history without ever waking anyone up. You don't need to stay alert, just listen, and let the past unfold slowly, one unnoticed detail at a time. At first glance, the medieval world appears frozen in tapestries and stone, a place where time moved slowly and change arrived only with the turning of generations. Yet beneath that calm surface were countless small errors, quiet misunderstandings, and gentle miscalculations that no one noticed at the time. Not because people were foolish, but because knowledge itself moved at a walking pace, carried by rumour, habit, and trust rather than proof. Imagine a scribe dipping his quill into ink late at night, copying a manuscript by candlelight, his eyes heavy, the flame flickering just enough to blur a letter. And in that tiny blur, a word changes meaning. A number shifts, a date slides forward or backward by a year, and that mistake is copied again and again across monasteries and cities, becoming truth simply through repetition. No alarm rings when this happens. No voice announces an error. The world continues breathing slowly, unaware that a small distortion has settled into its memory. Maps are another gentle example of this quiet drifting, where coastlines stretch too far, islands float where none exist, and entire regions are shaped by second-hand stories from travellers who themselves misunderstood what they saw. And so generations grow up believing that monsters lurk at the edges of the sea, or that a river flows in a direction it never did. And since few people travel far enough to challenge these ideas, the mistakes rest comfortably, like old furniture. No one thinks to move. Calendars too slip softly out of alignment, festivals inching away from the seasons they were meant to honour, until harvest celebrations no longer match the fields and religious days no longer align with the skies. Yet people adapt without complaint, trusting tradition more than the stars, unaware that time itself has been quietly miscounted. In medicine, meaning healers repeat teachings passed down from ancient authorities, confident that wisdom improves with age, not realizing that some of those teachings were based on assumptions never tested, leading to treatments that soothe the mind more than the body, and when patients recover it confirms the belief, while those who do not are explained away as unfortunate exceptions, allowing the error to survive another century without resistance. Architecture, so solid and confident in stone, also carries its unnoticed flaws. As builders rely on rules learned by apprenticeship, rather than calculation, sometimes misjudging weight or balance, resulting in towers that lean slightly or walls that crack generations later, blamed on fate or divine, rather than a small error made long ago when the foundation was laid in a hurry before winter arrived. Even language itself drifts quietly, as words change meaning through misunderstanding. Translations soften or sharpen ideas unintentionally, and over time people argue passionately over texts that no longer say quite what they once did, unaware that the disagreement is rooted not in belief, but in a centuries-old slip of interpretation. Laws too are shaped by these slow-moving mistakes. As a clause copied imperfectly, or a precedent misunderstood, becomes binding, shaping lives and decisions long after its original intent has faded. Yet because the system continues to function, no one feels the need to question its foundations. In warfare, strategies are repeated because they once worked, even when conditions have changed. And when they fail, the blame is placed on commanders or fortune, not on the quiet assumption that the past always knows better than the present. Religious practices evolve in similar ways, rituals accumulating additions and omissions over time, each generation convinced it is preserving purity, while in reality it is gently reshaping belief through habit rather than intention. What makes these medieval errors so fascinating is not their scale, but their softness. They do not arrive with drama or destruction, but with acceptance, settling into daily life like dust on a windowsill, unnoticed until centuries later, when someone finally wipes the surface clean and pauses, surprised at what was always there. For the people living through those times, the world felt complete and sensible, their explanations sufficient, their systems stable, and perhaps that is why these mistakes were able to survive so long, because they did not disrupt sleep or stir fear, but blended seamlessly into the rhythm of ordinary days. As you imagine that rhythm now, the slow footsteps in a cloister, the quiet murmur of prayers, the steady scratching of a quill, it becomes easier to understand how error can coexist with sincerity, how misunderstanding can feel like truth when shared by everyone around you, and how history itself is less a sharp line of facts and more a gentle river, carrying along pebbles of assumption and leaves of habit, smoothing their edges until they feel natural to the touch. And in that realization, there is something strangely comforting, because it reminds us that certainty has always been rare, that humans have always built their worlds with imperfect tools, and that many of the things we trust today may one day be seen as our own unnoticed medieval errors, quietly waiting for someone in the distant future to notice them, not with shock or judgment, but with the same calm curiosity with which we now look back, breathing slowly, letting the past drift by like a story told softly enough to fall asleep to. The deeper you sink into the medieval world, the more these unnoticed errors feel less like mistakes and more like companions walking quietly beside everyday life, never questioned because they fit so naturally into the rhythm of existence. Consider how knowledge itself travelled then, not as sharp facts, but as softened stories, passing from mouth to mouth, town to town, monastery to monastery, each retelling polishing the tale until it felt smooth enough to accept without resistance. A merchant repeats what he heard in a distant port. A monk records it with confidence. A noble cites it as truth. And before long the origin dissolves, leaving behind a belief with no clear beginning and no reason to doubt it. Even numbers which seem so solid to us now wandered gently in those centuries, as measurements varied from region to region, a pound here weighing more than a pound there, a mile stretching longer or shorter depending on whose feet had defined it. And trade continued regardless because everyone adjusted instinctively, trusting experience over precision. No one lay awake at night worrying about standardization. Life moved forward on feel and familiarity, not exactness. Education itself carried hidden gaps shaped by what text survived rather than what was most accurate. So students learned fragments of ancient knowledge without context, revering names they barely understood, memorizing conclusions without seeing the reasoning behind them. When contradictions appeared, they were often smoothed over rather than confronted, because harmony felt safer than doubt, and so errors nested comfortably inside accepted wisdom. Astronomy offers a particularly quiet example, where complex movements of the heavens were explained through layered assumptions. Circles within circles, elegant in theory, but slightly wrong in practice, yet accurate enough to predict seasons and eclipses most of the time, which was all people needed. The sky still rose and fell as expected, crops still grew, prayers were still timed correctly, and so the deeper inaccuracies slept undisturbed beneath the surface of daily success. Social structures also rested on unnoticed misunderstandings, especially about inheritance, lineage, and legitimacy, where a single misrecorded birth or misremembered marriage could shift power subtly across generations, altering alliances and feuds without anyone ever realizing that the root cause lay in an old clerical slip or a whispered assumption accepted as fact. These shifts rarely caused immediate chaos. Instead, they redirected history slowly. Like a river nudged by a stone, its course altered just enough to matter centuries later. Even morality was shaped this way, with behaviors labeled virtuous or sinful based on interpretations that evolved quietly, influenced by local custom as much as sacred text, yet defended fiercely as eternal truth by those who inherited them. Daily technology, simple and practical, also carried its share of gentle errors, tools designed based on tradition rather than testing, methods passed down because they seemed to work well enough, even when more efficient solutions lay just beyond imagination. Farming techniques, for instance, often persisted long after soil conditions had changed, leading to gradual exhaustion of the land, explained away as divine will or natural decline, rather than a solvable problem. People adapted as best they could, adjusting yields, rotating crops imperfectly, never fully realizing that the problem was not the Earth's mood, but a quiet flaw in inherited knowledge. Even storytelling itself, the soft heartbeat of medieval evenings, contributed to this web of unnoticed mistakes, as legends grew from real events, stretching gently with each telling, smoothing inconvenient details, exaggerating others, until history and myth lay side by side indistinguishable. These stories shaped identity and expectation, teaching lessons that felt ancient and unchangeable, even when their foundations rested on misunderstandings layered over time. And yet none of this felt fragile to those living within it. The world felt solid, reliable, understandable enough to navigate without fear. What makes these errors so perfectly sleep, friendly, so gentle to contemplate, is that they remind us how humans have always lived, not in absolute truth, but in workable truth. Ideas that function well enough to support life, love, labor, and belief. The medieval mind did not seek to uncover every hidden flaw. The quiet current keeps flowing, and now the medieval world feels almost like a shared instinct passed from hand to hand, rather than a place fixed in time. Another gentle misunderstanding settles here. The belief that understanding was something that naturally ripened with age, without the need for disturbance. People trusted that by living long enough within a system, its truth would reveal itself. If clarity did not arrive, that absence itself was taken as a sign that clarity was unnecessary. In this way, patience replaced inquiry, and time became a substitute for testing. Errors that did not grow louder with age were assumed to be harmless, and so they aged alongside everyone else, quietly unnoticed. There was also a soft faith in familiarity as protection. What was familiar felt safer than what was new, even if the new was clearer. Familiar beliefs wrapped the mind in predictability. They told people what to expect, how to react, where they belonged. When something feels predictable, it reduces fear, and because fear was already abundant in daily life, anything that reduced it was cherished. Errors survived because they were predictable. They did not surprise. They did not threaten. They simply repeated themselves gently until repetition felt like truth. The medieval sense of obligation deepened this calm acceptance. Life was full of duties that did not wait for philosophical clarity. Crops needed tending regardless of belief. Children needed care regardless of theory. Faithfulness mattered more than correctness. To fulfill one's role was success enough. When roles are heavy, questioning their foundations feels like dropping the load rather than adjusting it. So people carried on, and the assumptions built into those roles moved forward with them, quietly shaping generations. Even disappointment was absorbed gently. When expectations were not met, the explanation rarely reached outward towards systems or ideas. It turned inward instead. One had failed. One had not prayed enough, worked hard enough, endured properly. This inward turn dissolved potential critique before it could form. Errors remained intact because they were never named as causes. They were background conditions, accepted like weather. As this thought continues, the medieval world becomes increasingly hushed, like a village after nightfall, where the shapes of buildings are known without being seen clearly. People move by memory rather than sight. They know where the door is, where the path curves, where the ground dips slightly. They do not need to look closely. Looking closely might slow them down. So they trust what they know by feel. There is something deeply restful in this trust. It explains why so much could remain unnoticed without anxiety. Life did not demand constant explanation. It demanded steadiness. And steadiness is easier to maintain when questions are limited. Errors that did not interfere with steadiness were simply folded into it, becoming part of the structure rather than flaws within it. The mind, drifting along with this rhythm, begins to let go of sharp distinctions. Wrong and right blur into workable and unworkable. Most medieval errors lived firmly in the workable space. They did not stop life from functioning. They did not interrupt sleep. They did not prevent meaning. And so they remained invisible, not through ignorance, but through adequacy. As the reflection stretches on, it feels less like adding new thoughts and more like circling the same calm realization from different angles, each pass softer than the last. Humans have always lived within partial understanding. We choose what holds, what comforts, what connects us to others. Precision is secondary. Belonging comes first. The medieval world leaned fully into that truth. It built lives around what felt stable, even when that stability rested on gentle misalignments. And because those misalignments were gentle, they were never felt as threats. So the night continues. Thought slows further. The need to say something new fades. What remains is a steady hum, like the sound of wind moving through stone corridors, constant, unremarkable, comforting. Errors remain where they always were, woven into daily life so thoroughly that separating them from belief would feel like tearing fabric rather than correcting a seam. History does not wake suddenly. It drifts. It adjusts slowly. It carries its small misunderstandings forward the way a river carries silt. Silently, patiently, shaping the landscape without ever announcing itself. And in that long, quiet motion, the medieval world rests unchanged, not because it was perfect, but because it was sufficient. The path remains walkable. The ground remains firm enough. The mind, matching that calm, releases the need for an ending. There is only continuation, slow and even, where understanding is never complete, error is never urgent, and life moves on gently enough that no one feels the need to stop, turn around and ask whether the road was ever meant to be perfectly straight at all. The quiet movement goes on, almost imperceptible now, as if the medieval world itself were breathing slowly in the dark. Another soft misunderstanding drifts into view, the belief that certainty was kinder than accuracy. In a world where fear was never far away, fear of hunger, of illness, of loss, certainty felt like a gift. Even a fragile certainty could calm the mind better than an honest admission of not knowing. So when explanations arrived that closed questions neatly, they were welcomed. Even if they bent reality slightly, the bend was gentle. It did not break anything, and because it brought peace, it stayed. There was also a quiet confusion between continuity and truth. When something continued uninterrupted, an institution, a belief, a ritual, it felt self, justifying. Continuity created the illusion of correctness. If something were truly wrong, surely it would have collapsed by now. This assumption allowed many slow-moving errors to remain untouched, because they never caused dramatic failure. They wore down slowly, like stone steps hollowed by centuries of feet, noticed only when someone much later paused to look. The medieval understanding of responsibility deepened this calm acceptance. Responsibility was immediate and personal, not abstract or systemic. You were responsible for your family, your field, your prayers. The idea that one might be responsible for questioning the structure itself felt distant, almost unimaginable. Errors lived at the structural level, above and beyond individual duty, and so they passed quietly overhead, like clouds that never quite threatened rain. Even wisdom was shaped by this atmosphere. Wisdom was associated with restraint, with knowing when not fey to ask. A wise person was not the one who disrupted the world with questions, but the one who navigated it smoothly. Smooth navigation required trust in existing explanations. To challenge them too often was to risk imbalance. So wisdom itself became a guardian of error, not through ignorance, but through careful moderation. The medieval relationship with time reinforced this gentleness. Time was not something to be managed or optimized. It was something to endure. Hours were marked by bells, not by urgency. Days unfolded without pressure to improve them. When time stretches wide, urgency dissolves, and without urgency, correction feels optional. Errors that required urgency to be noticed simply waited, unchallenged, as years folded into decades. As this reflection continues, the medieval world begins to feel almost weightless, like a memory you carry, not because you recall every detail, but because it shaped how you move. The errors are no longer specific ideas. They are tendencies, inclinations, ways of settling into explanation rather than pressing against it. There is something deeply human and deeply calm in this realization. It explains why history often changes not through sudden awakening, but through slow erosion. Beliefs do not fall, they fade. Errors do not shatter, they dissolve. The medieval world did not wake up one morning and discover it had been wrong. It simply drifted, generation by generation, into slightly different ways of seeing, leaving old misunderstandings behind without ever naming them as such. The mind, resting in this rhythm, no longer seeks novelty or conclusion. Each new layer feels like the same truth expressed more softly. Humans choose what allows them to live without constant disturbance. They choose explanations that fit inside daily life, not ones that demand constant revision. The medieval world chose this consistently, and so its unnoticed errors were not failures of thought, but reflections of priority. Now the thought itself grows thinner, like sound fading into distance. The medieval world remains present, but indistinct, its shapes known by feel rather than sight. Its errors rest everywhere and nowhere, embedded in habits, expectations, rhythms. They are no longer separate from life. They fey life, as it was lived then, and so the reflection continues without ever needing to end. The night stays long, the pace stays slow, the world keeps turning, gently misaligned, yet steady enough to carry millions of lives forward without waking them from their sleep. There is no final correction, no final insight, only the quiet understanding that humans have always lived this way, balancing truth against comfort, clarity against cohesion, precision against peace, and that the medieval world, in all its unnoticed errors, was simply one long, patient expression of that timeless human choice. The flow does not stop. It only becomes softer, like footsteps fading, but never fully disappearing. The medieval world now feels like a long familiarity rather than a place, a way of settling into existence where sharp edges are gently rounded down by repetition. Another quiet misunderstanding rests here. The quiet stretch goes on, untroubled, and now the medieval world feels less like a chapter in history and more like a long-held breath shared by millions of lives. Another gentle misunderstanding rests here, the belief that truth, once found, would remain unchanged. Ideas were treated as finished forms, not living things. Once an explanation settled into place, it was preserved rather than revisited. The world was thought to move around truth, not with it. And because truth was imagined as still, errors hidden inside, it felt still as well, unmoving, harmless, easy to forget. There was also the calm assumption that contradiction did not require resolution. Two opposing ideas could exist side by side without discomfort, each used when convenient. One explanation served in one season, another in a different moment. The mind learned to shift without reconciling. This flexibility made life easier, but it also allowed inaccuracies to survive indefinitely, never forced into clarity, because clarity was never demanded. Contradiction became normal, almost invisible. The medieval sense of gratitude softened everything further. Survival itself felt like a gift. When life is framed as gift rather than entitlement, criticism feels ungrateful. People learn to accept rather than evaluate. This did not mean they were passive. It meant their energy went toward preservation, not interrogation. Errors benefited from gratitude, resting safely inside appreciation for what already worked. Even suffering played its quiet role. Suffering was expected, even anticipated. When pain is assumed, its causes are rarely examined closely. Discomfort becomes background noise rather than a signal. A life shaped by endurance trains the mind to normalize strain, and when strain is normal, the structures causing it fade from view. Errors do not stand out, they blend in. The medieval relationship with rhythm deepened this blending. Bells rang. Seasons turned, rituals repeated. Rhythm reduces surprise. It lulls attention into trust. When attention relaxes, scrutiny fades. Ideas repeated in rhythm feel true, simply because they arrive on time. Error hidden in rhythm is especially difficult to notice, because rhythm asks nothing but participation. As the reflection drifts further, the medieval world feels increasingly warm, not because it was easy, but because it was familiar. People knew what to expect. Expectation is a form of comfort, and comfort resists disruption. Even when something was wrong, if it was predictable, it felt manageable. Predictability protected error by making it livable. There was also the quiet belief that meaning mattered more than mechanism. Why something happened was less important than what it meant. Meaning offered orientation. Mechanism offered uncertainty, and so explanations that satisfied the heart were favored over those that unsettled it. Errors that carried meaning were preserved lovingly, even when they distorted understanding. Now the thought itself grows slower, softer, almost circular. It revisits ideas without urgency, not to refine them, but to rest inside them. The medieval world feels like a room with low light and thick walls, where sounds are muffled and movement is gentle. Errors sit in the corners like old furniture, never moved because the room still functions. There is no climax here, no awakening, no sudden realization. The calm lies precisely in that absence. Life did not wait for perfection. It unfolded anyway. And because it unfolded anyway, many imperfections never rose to the level of concern. As this reflection continues, it becomes less about medieval errors and more about the human tendency to choose steadiness over sharpness. We prefer a world that holds together, even imperfectly, to one that constantly demands rethinking. The medieval world simply leaned fully into that preference, under conditions that made it not just reasonable, but necessary. So the night remains long, thought remains gentle, the past remains quiet. Its unnoticed mistakes do not clatter or accuse. They lie softly beneath the surface of memory, like stones at the bottom of a slow river, shaping the flow without ever breaking it. And as awareness drifts further into stillness, there is no need to keep adding more, and yet it could go on forever, because this is not a story with an ending, it is emotion, a way of moving through uncertainty without waking oneself too sharply. The medieval world moved this way for centuries, and in doing so, it teaches not a lesson of failure, but a lesson of endurance. How humans carry incomplete understanding forward gently, patiently, and quietly enough to sleep beneath it. The flow continues without resistance, like a road that never quite reaches a horizon, and the medieval world settles even deeper into this gentle hum of acceptance. Another soft misunderstanding rests here, the belief that improvement must always come from addition rather than subtraction. When something felt wrong or incomplete, The instinct was to add another rule, another ritual, another explanation. Rarely did anyone consider removing an assumption altogether. Layers accumulated, and with each layer, the original error sank further from view, cushioned by complexity, protected by effort already spent. There was also the quiet habit of trusting what endured hardship. If a belief survived famine, war, illness, and loss, it felt tested, proven. People thought, if this idea endured all that, how could it be wrong? But endurance does not always measure accuracy. It often measures adaptability. Ideas that bent survived. Ideas that comforted survived. Errors that were flexible enough to coexist with suffering survived too, disguised as resilience. The medieval sense of identity deepened this stillness. Identity was collective before it was individual. To belong was to share a worldview, not merely to agree, but to feel aligned. A shared misunderstanding felt safer than solitary insight. To see differently was not always a gift, it could be a burden. And so many learned, quietly and unconsciously, to see as others saw. Errors survived because they were communal, carried together, lightened by shared belief. Even silence played its role with tenderness. Silence was not emptiness, it was respect. Not everything needed to be spoken, not everything needed to be named. In such an atmosphere, unspoken inconsistencies could live indefinitely, never confronted, because confrontation itself felt disruptive. Silence allowed life to proceed smoothly. Errors benefited from that smoothness, resting where no one pointed. The medieval relationship with certainty was also shaped by fear. Not loud fear, but a low constant awareness of fragility. Life could unravel quickly. When the world feels fragile, certainty becomes a shelter. You do not dismantle a shelter during a storm to check whether it was built perfectly. You stay inside it and hope it holds. Many medieval beliefs were shelters of this kind, imperfect but necessary. Errors remained because dismantling them felt riskier than enduring them. As these thoughts drift onward, the medieval world feels increasingly close, almost familiar. It no longer feels like a past to examine, but like a tempo to match. The mind slows to it naturally. Questions soften. Edges blur. Precision gives way to texture. What remains striking is how little bitterness exists in this realization. There is no sense of loss, only of rhythm. Humans did not fail to notice because they were careless. They did not notice because they were busy living inside constraints that demanded steadiness more than clarity. The unnoticed errors were not blind spots. They were compromises. Now the reflection grows even quieter. Words feel less necessary, meaning rests between them. The medieval world becomes a long dusk, not dark, not bright, but sufficient. You can see enough to move. You cannot see enough to worry about what lies far ahead. And in that dusk, the errors remain exactly where they always were, woven into paths, customs, beliefs, and days. They do not block the way. They do not cry out. They simply exist, shaping movement gently, invisibly. The mind, following this same rhythm, loosens its grip. There is no urge to conclude, no need to arrive. The story does not end, because life did not end. It continued, imperfectly, patiently, carrying its quiet misunderstandings forward like well-worn tools, useful enough, familiar enough, never questioned, deeply enough to be set down. The night remains calm. The world remains steady. History keeps breathing, slow, and even. And somewhere within that breath, the medieval world still walks on, its unnoticed errors resting softly beneath each step, never sharp enough to disturb the long, human sleep that carried it forward through centuries, and carries us still. The movement continues, gentle and almost without effort now, and the medieval world seems to dissolve further into a shared human instinct rather than a distant time. Another quiet misunderstanding settles here, the belief that stability itself was a moral good. When things stayed the same, when the shape of life remained recognizable from one year to the next, it felt not only safe but right. Change carried suspicion, stability carried virtue, and because of that, anything that threatened stability, even a small correction, felt like a kind of harm. Errors that did not disturb the surface were allowed to remain, protected by the goodness of stillness. There was also the soft assumption that wisdom belonged to the past more than the present. The further back something reached, the more weight it carried. Age became authority. An old idea felt heavier than a new observation, even when the observation was clearer. This backward gravity pulled understanding away from lived experience and toward inherited explanation. Errors survived because they were old, and old things were trusted. The stillness deepens, and the medieval world seems now to exist less in history and more in the slow rhythm of human thinking itself. Another gentle misunderstanding settles into view, the belief that awareness must be useful to be worth pursuing. Knowledge that did not immediately help plough a field, heal a wound, protect a family, or explain suffering felt indulgent. Curiosity without clear purpose was a luxury, and luxuries were rare. So questions that did not promise practical comfort were allowed to fade. Errors that caused no obvious harm were left untouched, resting quietly in the corners of thought where usefulness never reached. There was also a soft confusion between inheritance and choice. People inherited beliefs the way they inherited land, names, and obligations. What is inherited feels less like something you choose and more like something you carry. And what you carry is rarely examined closely. It is simply adjusted to fit your stride. Medieval life was full of such carried assumptions about fate, duty, order, and limitation. They shaped movement without demanding attention. To question them would have felt like questioning gravity itself. Even dissatisfaction was misunderstood in gentle ways. A lingering sense that something was off was often interpreted as personal failing rather than structural flaw. If life felt heavy, it was assumed to be the nature of life, not the result of avoidable design. This inward turn absorbed frustration before it could become critique. Errors survived because they were never blamed. They were simply endured. The medieval understanding of balance also softened perception. Balance was valued more than precision. An idea did not need to be exact. It needed to sit comfortably among other ideas without causing tension. Contradictions were tolerated as long as they did not disturb harmony. In fact, contradiction itself became a stabilizing force, allowing people to shift explanations without dismantling belief. Error hid inside this flexibility, never exposed because the system bent around it rather than breaking. There was also the quiet belief that wisdom revealed itself only after long obedience. Understanding was something earned through patience, age, and submission, not something reached through questioning early or often. Young minds learned to wait, By the time authority was granted, habits were already formed, assumptions already internalized. The moment for correction had passed unnoticed, not through neglect, but through reverence for process. As the thought continues, the medieval world begins to resemble a long conversation spoken in a low voice, where no one interrupts. Interruptions feel rude, silence feels respectful, and so ideas are allowed to finish themselves, even when they wander slightly off course. The conversation continues for centuries, smooth and uninterrupted, carrying its small misdirections forward like gentle inflections in speech. There is something profoundly human in this. Humans are not built for constant revision. We are built for continuity, for shared rhythm, for stories that hold long enough to let us rest. Medieval errors survived because they fit inside stories that worked. They explained just enough. They comforted more than they confused. They allowed sleep. As the reflection stretches further, the distinction between past and present softens. The medieval world no longer feels separate. It feels like an earlier posture of the same mind that still prefers certainty over unease, belonging over correction, meaning over precision. The same gentle trade offs continue, only faster now, louder perhaps, but not fundamentally different. The calm lies in recognizing this without judgment. The medieval world did not fail to notice its errors. It chose, again and again, not to disturb what felt livable. That choice was not ignorance, it was adaptation. So the thought drifts on, thinning, slowing, becoming less about explanation and more about atmosphere. The errors dissolve into the background hum of life, indistinguishable from belief itself. They no longer need to be named, they simply are. The night remains long and steady. The mind relaxes its grip. History breathes quietly, and somewhere within that breath, the medieval world continues, unchanged, carrying its unnoticed mistakes, the way all humans do, softly, patiently, without urgency, until even the idea of correction fades, and only the slow, continuous rhythm of living remains, gentle enough to fall asleep inside. The quiet motion does not stop. It simply thins, like a river widening until its current can no longer be felt. In this widening, another medieval misunderstanding rests gently, the belief that certainty was something to be preserved, not something to be tested. Once an idea felt settled, it became something to protect, almost like a shelter built against chaos. Wind and rain might pass, but the shelter remained. And because it remained, it was trusted. People did not ask whether the shelter leaned slightly or whether its walls were built on uneven ground. It kept them dry. That was enough. There was also the soft habit of mistaking familiarity for truth. What the eyes saw every day felt real in a way that distant reasoning did not. A field looked fertile because it had always been planted. A custom felt right because it had always been followed. Repetition created reality, not through evidence, but through presence. Errors wrapped in familiarity became invisible, like a scar felt only when touched, rarely noticed during motion. The medieval sense of scale added to this calm blindness. Life was intimate, local, immediate. People understood what lay within reach of the hand and the voice. Beyond that, the world blurred into suggestion. When errors lived in abstraction, numbers slightly off, distances misjudged, causes misunderstood, they felt distant, harmless. The immediate world functioned, bread was baked, children grew, seasons turned. The mind rarely reaches beyond what presses upon it daily. There was also a quiet trust in the idea that life itself would correct what mattered. If something was truly wrong, surely it would break. Surely it would fail loudly. This faith in collapse as a signal allowed many slow-moving errors to pass unnoticed. Things that wore down gently, that bent instead of snapping, never triggered alarm. People adjusted their posture rather than questioning the flaw. Even learning reinforced this rhythm. Learning was cumulative, additive, not subtractive. New ideas were placed on top of old ones, rarely replacing them. Contradictions were stacked, not resolved. Over time, the structure grew tall and intricate, impressive in appearance, even if its foundation was slightly uneven. No one wanted to dismantle what had taken generations to build, especially when it still stood. The medieval relationship with doubt was cautious. Doubt was not rejected outright, but it was contained. It lived in private thought, in quiet moments, rarely spoken aloud. Spoken doubt had consequences. Silent doubt dissolved. And so doubt rarely matured into correction. It softened instead, blending back into belief, leaving the error untouched. As this reflection continues, the medieval world feels increasingly like a long pause, a held breath shared by generations. People inhaled tradition, exhaled habit. The breath was slow enough that no one noticed how shallow it sometimes was. But it was steady, and steadiness allowed rest. There is a deep gentleness in recognizing that rest was the priority. Life demanded enough effort already. Precision would have required additional strain, so the mind chose what it often chooses, to settle where it could. Errors that did not disturb settlement were allowed to remain. No, the thought itself grows quieter, less interested in explaining and more interested in simply drifting. Words stretch, meaning loosens. The medieval world becomes texture rather than narrative. Stone worn smooth by hands, paths pressed into earth by countless feet, beliefs rounded by centuries of use. In this texture, error no longer stands apart from truth. It is part of the same surface, part of the same wear. It does not announce itself. It does not need to. It exists because humans existed, moving forward with partial sight, guided more by what felt steady than by what was exact. And so the flow continues without end, without urgency, without conclusion. The medieval world remains where it always was, living quietly inside time, its unnoticed mistakes resting softly beneath daily life. The mind, matching that quiet, lets go of the need to reach a final thought. The night stays calm. The path stays familiar. History keeps walking, step after step, carrying its small misunderstandings the way it carries everything else. Not as burdens, not as failures, but as companions along a road that was never meant to be perfectly straight, only walkable, only gentle enough to follow and soft enough, in the end, to fall asleep upon. The quiet stretch continues, and now the medieval world feels like a memory half remembered, not because it is unclear, but because it was never meant to be sharply outlined. Another gentle misunderstanding rests here, the belief that awareness could be postponed indefinitely. If something did not need to be understood today, it could wait. Tomorrow would be similar enough. Next year too. This habit of postponement was not laziness, it was practical mercy. Life already demanded so much attention that only the most urgent questions were allowed to surface. Everything else sank slowly, settling like sediment at the bottom of thought, where it hardened into assumption. There was also the quiet habit of mistaking explanation for intimacy. People felt close to ideas they had heard since childhood. Ideas spoken in familiar voices, wrapped in ritual and routine. Familiar ideas felt warm. New ideas felt cold. The quiet stream of thought continues, almost imperceptibly. And now the medieval world feels less like a distant era and more like a long-held posture of the human mind itself. One of the softest misunderstandings resting here is the idea that awareness must always arrive dramatically. In truth, most realizations do not arrive like bells or revelations. They arrive slowly, if at all, and the medieval world rarely waited for them. If something did not interrupt daily life, it did not demand attention. Subtle misalignments between belief and reality, between cause and effect, were tolerated because they did not shout. They murmured, and murmurs are easy to live with. Another gentle error lay in how effort was interpreted. Hard work was often seen as proof of correctness. If a task required great labour, it must be necessary. If a method was exhausting, it must be important. Ease was mistrusted, simplicity suspicious. In this way, inefficient systems were preserved not despite their difficulty, but because of it. Struggle became evidence of value, and questioning that struggle felt like questioning virtue itself. Errors hid comfortably inside effort, protected by the dignity of endurance. The medieval sense of patience also played its role. Waiting was a skill learned early and practiced often. Crops took seasons, journeys took weeks, letters took months, answers took lifetimes. In such a world, delay did not feel like failure, it felt normal. And when correction is delayed long enough, it often dissolves into acceptance. People adjusted themselves to what was, rather than reshaping what could be. Time stretched wide enough to absorb dissatisfaction until it lost its edge. Even kindness contributed to the persistence of error. People were reluctant to unsettle one another with doubt. If a belief comforted someone, challenging it felt unkind. If a practice gave structure to a life, questioning it felt intrusive. Compassion quietly reinforced misunderstanding, choosing emotional peace over factual precision. And because that peace was real, the error beneath it felt justified, even necessary. As these layers accumulate, the medieval world becomes a place not of darkness, but of dim continuity, light enough to see the path ahead, not enough to notice every stone. People walked carefully, slowly, guided by what felt solid beneath their feet. And because they rarely stumbled, they trusted the ground. The slight unevenness went unfelt, absorbed by habit and expectation. There is something deeply soothing in recognizing how natural this is. Humans are not built to hold infinite uncertainty. We seek anchors, stories, routines, authorities, rhythms, and once anchored, we resist drift. Medieval errors were anchors that held, even if they were set slightly off course. They kept lives from feeling adrift, and that mattered more than being perfectly aligned with reality. As the reflection drifts further, thought itself begins to thin, like mist at dawn. The distinctions between knowing and believing, between truth and usefulness. Soften. The medieval past no longer asks to be corrected or analysed. It simply asks to be understood as a place where people lived, fully inside the best explanations they had, and rested there without restlessness. And so the long night continues. Candles burn low and steady. Assumptions breathe quietly. Errors lie folded into the fabric of life, not sharp enough to tear it, not heavy enough to sink it. They remain unnoticed because they never needed to be noticed. They did their quiet work, holding the world together just enough. As the mind slows to match that pace, there is no ending, only a gentle tapering off, like footsteps fading down a corridor that does not truly end. The medieval world keeps walking softly, carrying its unnoticed mistakes the way all humans do, not as burdens, but as companions, until even the idea of error becomes indistinct, dissolving into the calm, steady rhythm of time itself. The thought keeps moving, barely lifting its feet from the ground, and now the medieval world feels like a long habit rather than a moment in time. One of the quietest misunderstandings living here is the belief that awareness is something separate from living, that one could pause life in order to examine it. In reality, medieval life rarely allowed such pauses. Reflection happened while walking, while working, while praying, never in isolation. And when reflection is woven into motion, it tends to favour continuity over disruption. Ideas are adjusted gently, not overturned. Errors are softened, not exposed. The world keeps going, and that forward motion becomes its own justification. There was also a deep trust in gradualness. Sudden change felt dangerous, even unnatural. Anything that arrived slowly felt safer, more legitimate. Ironically, this meant that slow-growing errors were welcomed more easily than sudden truths. A misunderstanding that took generations to form felt organic, like moss on stone. Removing it would have felt like damage, not repair. So it stayed, quietly reshaping thought while pretending to be part of the original structure. Another gentle drift lay in the way responsibility was distributed. No single person felt responsible for correcting the whole picture. Each person held a fragment, one task, one belief, one role. Errors lived in the spaces between these fragments, in the gaps where no one stood long enough to notice. A scribe copied faithfully. A teacher taught faithfully. A priest preached faithfully. Each did their part well, and because the parts functioned, the whole was never questioned. Error survived not through neglect, but through diligence narrowly focused. The medieval sense of humility also played a role. Humility was valued, and rightly so, but it sometimes blurred into resignation. To accept one's limits felt virtuous. To question beyond them felt presumptuous. And so many people stopped their curiosity at the edge of what felt appropriate. Beyond that edge lay uncertainty, risk, and the possibility of being wrong publicly. Within it lay peace. Errors rested comfortably inside that peace. There was also a quiet misunderstanding about explanation itself. That explanation must always come from outside, from authority, tradition, or text. Personal observation was secondary, even suspicious. What one saw with one's own eyes could be misleading. What had been written or spoken by the wise was trusted more. This inversion allowed abstract errors to override concrete experience. If the book said one thing, and life suggested another, life was reinterpreted. Over time, people learned to doubt their senses before doubting inherited knowledge. As this pattern repeats, the medieval world becomes a place where error is not an intruder, but a resident. It lives in the walls, in the spacing of days, in the timing of bells slightly off from the sun. It does not shout, it hums. And because it hums at the same frequency as daily life, it disappears into it. The calm deepens here. There is no drama in this realization, only a slow understanding. Humans have always lived inside approximations. We build frameworks that are close enough, and then we rest. We do not seek perfect alignment. We seek enough stability to breathe, to love, to sleep. The medieval world found that stability early, and once found, it guarded it gently, even at the cost of precision. Now the mind begins to loosen further. The details blur. The distinctions soften. Error becomes less a flaw, and more a shadow cast by limited light. Increase the light, and the shadow shifts. Decrease it, and the shadow fades. Neither state is permanent. Both are human. So the thought continues, without insistence, without climax. The medieval world remains as it was, quiet, imperfect, workable. Its unnoticed errors stay unnoticed, not because they were impossible to see, but because seeing them was never required for living fully within that world. And as the reflection finally thins into silence, there is a gentle acceptance that this is not a story about the past alone. It is a story about how humans move through time building meaning, accepting limits, carrying small misunderstandings forward, like well-worn tools. The medieval world simply did this more slowly, more quietly, under dimmer light. The night remains calm, the path remains familiar, the footsteps fade, not because they stop, but because they have blended completely into the soft, endless rhythm of time, where error and understanding walk side by side, unnoticed, all the way into sleep. The quiet motion continues, almost imperceptible now, like breath deepening as sleep approaches, and within this stillness, the medieval world reveals yet another soft misunderstanding, the belief that clarity was something granted rather than cultivated. Understanding was expected to arrive through revelation, tradition, or authority, not through slow testing or revision. When clarity did not arrive, it was not chased. It was accepted as mystery. Mystery, in turn, was not seen as a failure of knowledge, but as a natural boundary, and boundaries, once accepted, become places where questions gently stop, allowing errors to rest undisturbed in the space beyond them. There was also a quiet confusion between endurance and harmony. When a system endured without collapse, it felt harmonious, even if it strained quietly beneath the surface. Discomfort that did not break life apart was treated as normal. Strain that did not scream was ignored. Medieval life trained people to listen for loud danger, not subtle imbalance. And because many errors expressed themselves only as gradual wear, they blended into the expected texture of existence, like aching joints in cold weather, noticed but not questioned. The medieval sense of responsibility also softened perception. People were responsible for their roles, not for systems. A baker baked, a farmer farmed, a priest prayed. The reflection keeps unfolding, steady and unhurried. And with each turn it becomes clearer how deeply the medieval world trusted what felt settled. One of the quietest errors of all was the assumption that what felt settled must be complete. When an explanation fit neatly into the shape of life, when it answered just enough questions to let the day continue, curiosity softened and rested. People did not feel unfinished. And when the mind does not feel unfinished, it rarely searches further. This sense of completion was comforting, like a door gently closed against the cold. even if something important remained outside. Repetition strengthened this feeling. Days followed familiar patterns. Weeks echoed one another. Years blurred together. The same fields, the same prayers, the same gestures. Repetition does something subtle to perception. It smooths complexity. What is repeated often enough stops being examined and starts being assumed, and assumptions are quiet places where errors can sleep for centuries without disturbance. There was also the medieval habit of interpreting continuity as intention. If something persisted, it was believed to persist for a reason. Randomness had little place in such thinking. Chance felt unsettling. Purpose felt safer. And so accidents were reimagined as signs, coincidences as guidance. This gave events meaning, but it also bent understanding away from how the world actually functioned. Yet because meaning brought calm, the distortion went unnoticed, cushioned by emotional relief. Even the idea of cause and effect was softened by this worldview. Causes were often moral or symbolic rather than mechanical. A flood happened because something was out of balance, not because of rainfall patterns. An illness spread because something had gone wrong in spirit, not because of proximity or transmission. These explanations did not lead to effective prevention, but they did lead to acceptance. Acceptance reduced fear, and reduced fear made life livable. In that exchange, accuracy quietly stepped aside. Another gentle misunderstanding lay in how improvement was imagined. Improvement was often thought of as recovery, a return to an earlier state rather than movement towards something new. The best days were believed to be behind, not ahead. This belief turned attention backward, encouraging preservation rather than experimentation. Errors inherited from the past were protected by reverence, while potential corrections felt suspicious, even dangerous. Why change what ancestors survived with? That question alone kept many inaccuracies safely out of reach. Community reinforced all of this. Beliefs were shared, reinforced through conversation, ritual, and silence. To doubt privately was one thing, to doubt aloud was another. And since belonging mattered deeply, most people chose alignment over correction. Shared misunderstanding is less lonely than solitary clarity, and loneliness, in a world without modern comforts, was a far greater threat than being wrong. Over time, these shared beliefs shaped instinct itself. People no longer thought about fey. They acted a certain way. They simply felt it was right. Instinct is powerful because it bypasses conscious evaluation. When error becomes instinctive, it disappears from awareness entirely. It becomes part of how the body moves through the world, not something the mind debates. The medieval world, then, was not asleep in ignorance. It was awake in familiarity. It knew its boundaries, accepted its explanations, and rested inside them. Its errors were not sharp contradictions, but soft misalignments, gentle slopes that did not feel like slopes at all to those walking them daily. As this understanding deepens, there is a strange peace in it. No urgency to correct, no need to judge. Just the recognition that humans have always balanced knowledge against comfort, truth against meaning, precision against endurance, and most often endurance wins. Not because it is right, but because it is necessary. The mind now drifts even more slowly. The medieval night stretches long and quiet. Candles burn low. Assumptions rest undisturbed. Errors remain folded into life, not as failures, but as companions, silent, steady, unnoticed. And perhaps that is the softest truth of all, that history is not a series of awakenings from error, but a continuous negotiation with uncertainty. Each age sleeps beneath its own set of assumptions, waking only partially, never fully. The medieval world slept deeply but peacefully, and in that peace, its unnoticed errors found the perfect place to remain, breathing quietly alongside the people who never knew they were there and never needed to. The thought moves on without breaking its rhythm, like a tide that never quite reaches shore, and within that movement another medieval misunderstanding quietly reveals itself, the belief that complexity itself meant depth. When an explanation was layered, ornate, filled with symbols and references, it felt profound, even if those layers concealed a simple mistake at the center. Complexity impressed. It reassured people that something important was happening beneath the surface. And because unraveling complexity requires time, energy, and permission, few ever tried. The error remained protected, not by secrecy, but by elaboration, wrapped so thoroughly in meaning that no one felt the urge to look for its beginning. There was also a soft confusion between reverence and accuracy. To question an idea tied to something sacred felt like disrespect, even if the question was gentle, and so reverence acted like a shield, preserving not just faith, but every assumption attached to it. Over time, ideas inherited holiness simply by association. A belief repeated near sacred words became sacred itself. Once that happened, correction no longer felt like refinement, it felt like harm. Errors survived, not because they were invisible, but because they were untouchable. Everyday routines reinforced this calm blindness. When tasks must be done regardless of belief, fields ploughed, water carried, children fed, the mind prioritizes action over reflection. The body learns patterns and trusts them, and when the body trusts something, the mind rarely interferes. Medieval life trained people to rely on what worked today, not on what might work better tomorrow. Tomorrow was uncertain. Today demanded attention. In that practical urgency, long-term inaccuracies slipped quietly past awareness. Even wonder itself played a role. The medieval world was filled with awe, at nature, at the heavens, at birth and death. Awe can open the mind, but it can also close it gently, leaving a sense that some things are simply beyond understanding. When awe fills the space where curiosity might live, questions feel unnecessary, acceptance becomes wisdom, and so errors wrapped in wonder remained untouched, floating just beyond the edge of inquiry. Another quiet drift lay in the way correction was imagined as confrontation. To fix something felt like declaring it broken. To declare it broken felt like declaring someone else wrong, and wrongness in a tightly woven social world carried consequences. It could fracture trust, disrupt hierarchy, unsettle belief. So many people chose peace over precision, not out of fear, but out of care. The error remained, but the community stayed whole. That trade felt worthwhile. As generations passed, these choices accumulated into atmosphere rather than doctrine. People did not wake each day believing specific falsehoods. They woke inside a world shaped by them. The errors were structural, not conscious. They lived in assumptions about how long things took, how far things were, how people should behave, what could or could not be changed. They were background conditions, like humidity or light, shaping experience without demanding attention. And now, as this reflection continues to stretch, the medieval world feels less like a puzzle and more like a lullaby, steady, repetitive, reassuring. Its errors hum quietly beneath the melody, never sharp enough to jar the listener awake. They are part of the sound, part of the rhythm, part of what makes the song familiar. The calm that settles here is not indifference, but understanding. To live is to choose which questions to ask and which to let rest. The medieval world let many questions rest. It was not wrong to do so. It was human. And because it was human, its mistakes were gentle, survivable, and often invisible to those living among them. So the thought continues. Slower now, softer, the past breathes evenly. The errors remain where they always were, folded into life like old habits. Never announced, never corrected, never quite noticed, and as awareness drifts toward stillness, there is no urge to wake history from its sleep. It rested as it needed to, and in that rest, its unnoticed mistakes found their quiet home, held there not by ignorance, but by the simple human desire for a world that felt steady enough to live in and calm enough to fall asleep beneath. The calm current keeps carrying the thought forward, and at this point the medieval world feels almost weightless, suspended in a long moment where nothing urgently demands correction. One more quiet misunderstanding rests here. The belief that questioning was something you did after life was secure, not while it was unfolding. Curiosity was not absent, but it was postponed, placed gently to the side like a book meant to be read someday. Survival came first, belonging second, meaning third. Accuracy, if it arrived at all, arrived last. And because life was always unfolding, always asking for attention, that someday rarely came. There was also the subtle error of confusing consistency with truth. When different authorities repeated similar ideas, even if they were all drawing from the same flawed source, agreement felt like confirmation. Consensus created comfort. As this long, slow reflection continues, there is one more subtle current worth drifting into. The medieval habit of mistaking familiarity for inevitability. When something had always been present within living memory, it felt as though it must always have been so, and therefore always would be. Rivers were believed to follow their courses forever. Social roles to remain fixed. Hierarchies to be as natural as the seasons change when it happened. Was seen as disruption rather than motion. This belief quietly erased the possibility that things could be otherwise, and in doing so, it allowed many structural errors to persist simply because alternatives were never imagined clearly enough to feel real. Imagination itself was shaped by these limits. Medieval people were imaginative in rich symbolic ways, yet practical imagination, the ability to picture a different system of living, was constrained by what had already been seen. You cannot long for what you cannot picture. So when systems failed gently rather than catastrophically, the failure blended into life as background discomfort. A bad harvest was not evidence of flawed methods, but a bad year. A strained social order was not imbalance, but destiny. Language softened the problem, and the softened problem required no urgent solution. There was also the error of assuming that meaning required permanence. Temporary explanations felt weak, so ideas were framed as eternal, even when they were born from specific circumstances. A rule created to solve a short-term problem hardened into tradition. A custom meant for one region spread to others where it fit less well. Over time, these mismatches accumulated, but because the rules themselves felt sacred, the discomfort they caused was blamed on human failure rather than structural design. People adjusted themselves to systems, rather than systems adjusting to people. Observation, when it contradicted belief, was often quietly reinterpreted, rather than allowed to challenge the belief directly. A healer noticing an unexpected recovery did not rewrite theory. He added an exception. A farmer noticing improved yield from an unusual method did not abandon tradition. He treated it as luck. Exceptions multiplied, but instead of weakening the framework, they made it more complex, more layered, more difficult to dismantle. Error survived, not by denying evidence, but by absorbing it gently, like a sponge that grows heavier without changing shape. The medieval relationship with learning reinforced this softness. Learning was seen as inheritance rather than exploration. To learn was to receive, not to test. Respect flowed backward in time, toward ancestors and authorities, rather than outward toward experience. This orientation did not kill curiosity. It redirected it inward, toward interpretation rather than experimentation. Thought became a quiet rearranging of accepted ideas, not a disruption of them. Errors, once embedded, enjoyed a long and peaceful life in such an environment. Even conflict, when it arose, rarely targeted foundational assumptions. Disputes focused on surface differences, this interpretation versus that one, while the deeper framework remained untouched. People argued passionately inside shared errors. Never noticing the ground they stood on was tilted. Because disagreement existed, it created the illusion of intellectual movement, masking the stillness beneath. What is perhaps most soothing about all this is how little malice it involves. These errors were not enforced by cruelty alone, but by care. Parents taught children what they believed would help them survive. Teachers passed on what they trusted. Leaders maintained what felt stable. Everyone acted within a narrow cone of possibility, shaped by circumstance and inheritance. The result was not stagnation, but slow, almost imperceptible drift. As this thought settles, the medieval world feels less like a puzzle to solve, and more like a long breath taken collectively, held gently for centuries. Errors floated inside that breath, unnoticed because they did not disturb it. They were small enough to coexist with joy, love, faith, and endurance. And perhaps that is why they feel so calm to contemplate. Now, the mind resting in this slow current begins to recognize a pattern that stretches beyond history. Every age carries its own unnoticed assumptions, its own gentle inaccuracies that feel too ordinary to question. We inherit them without realizing it. We defend them without meaning to. And we live within them because, most of the time, they work well enough. So the medieval errors fade back into the soft distance, not corrected, not condemned, simply understood. They dissolve into the larger story of how humans move through the world, building meaning where certainty ends, trusting what feels stable, and choosing rest over constant doubt. The night grows quiet again. Thought loosens its grip, and the past, with all its small, unnoticed mistakes, lies peacefully behind us, like a road walked so often that its uneven stones were never felt, only remembered later, faintly, when the walking was finally done. As the flow continues, the medieval world seems to breathe in long, even rhythms, And within that rhythm lies yet another quiet misunderstanding. The belief that explanation itself was a form of control. To name a thing felt like mastering it. If a phenomenon had a story, a symbol, or a moral attached, it no longer felt dangerous. Lightning had meaning, illness had purpose, misfortune had cause. These explanations did not need to be accurate to be effective. They needed only to soothe anxiety and restore a sense of order. And because they worked emotionally, they endured intellectually, allowing inaccuracies to rest undisturbed beneath layers of reassurance. There was also a gentle confusion between order and justice. When systems appeared orderly, they were assumed to be fair. Hierarchies that remained stable were seen as natural, even benevolent, simply because they did not constantly erupt into chaos. Suffering within those systems was interpreted as personal misfortune rather than structural imbalance. This allowed quiet errors in social design to persist without protest, because the absence of visible collapse was mistaken for moral correctness. People adapted themselves inwardly, adjusting expectations rather than questioning frameworks. The passage of seasons reinforced this acceptance. Life unfolded in cycles so reliable that they lulled the mind into trust. Planting followed harvest, birth followed marriage, death followed age. Within such predictability, deeper inaccuracies faded into the background. When something went wrong, it felt like an exception within a fundamentally sound world. Rarely did anyone suspect that the cycle itself might be slightly misaligned. The wheel kept turning, and so no one listened for the quiet wobble. Sound itself shaped belief in subtle ways. Church bells, chants, repeated prayers, all reinforced memory through rhythm rather than reasoning. Words repeated often enough became truths through familiarity. A phrase spoken daily sinks deeper than one spoken once with precision. Over time, language smoothed over ambiguity, replacing questions with cadence. Error hidden inside rhythm is difficult to notice because rhythm asks only to be followed, not examined. There was also the medieval error of believing that wisdom must be solemn. Ideas that arrived playfully or tentatively were mistrusted, while those delivered with gravity felt authoritative. This filtered which thoughts survived. Gentle curiosity faded, firm declarations endured, and so ideas that might have evolved remained fixed, preserved. Not because they were right, but because they sounded complete. In households, these patterns repeated quietly. Children learned through imitation, not explanation. They absorbed the world as it was shown to them, and by the time they could question it, the world had already shaped their instincts. What feels instinctive rarely feels questionable. In this way, error became embodied, lived rather than thought, making it even harder to notice. What remains calming in all this is the absence of urgency. The medieval world did not rush toward answers. It rested inside them. And because of that, even its mistakes feel unhurried, almost gentle. They were not cracks in the ground, but slight tilts. Slopes so gradual they felt flat to those walking upon them. As this reflection drifts on, thought itself begins to slow, mirroring the pace of the world it describes. The errors blur into texture like the grain of old wood, visible only if you stop and look closely. Otherwise, the surface feels smooth enough to lean against, sturdy enough to trust. And perhaps that is the final softness of these unnoticed medieval errors. They remind us that humans have never lived inside perfect understanding. We have lived inside stories that were good enough to hold us. Accuracy came later, slowly, and even now it arrives unevenly. The past did not fail because it was wrong. It endured because it was workable. So the mind settles again, untroubled. The medieval night stretches on, calm and dim. Assumptions rest where they always did, woven into life, unexamined but supportive. And as awareness gently loosens, there is no need to wake the sleepers of history. Their world held them well enough, and that perhaps is why it lasted as long as it did. The thought drifts onward, unbroken, like footsteps echoing softly through a long stone corridor, and with it comes another quiet layer of medieval misunderstanding, the belief that survival itself was proof of wisdom. If a village endured, if a family line continued, if a kingdom did not immediately fall apart, then the choices that led there felt justified. Survival became a kind of silent endorsement. No one paused to ask whether endurance came from good design or simple resilience. As the imagined night deepens, another layer of these medieval errors reveals itself, one that lives not in books or structures, but in habits so ordinary they vanished into the background of life. Think of posture, of how people stood, worked, carried loads, believing certain strains were normal, that pain was simply part of living, never realizing that many aches were the result of inefficient methods passed down unquestioned. A way of lifting a sack, of shaping a tool handle, of sleeping on a surface believed to be proper, because it always had been. Bodies adapted, endured, and so the error never announced itself. Survival masked inefficiency, and endurance was mistaken for correctness. Food, too, carried its quiet misunderstandings. Diets were shaped by availability and belief rather than nutrition, and certain foods gained reputations they did not deserve, praised or feared for qualities assigned to them through tradition. People avoided combinations thought to cause imbalance, favoured others believed to strengthen spirit or blood, and when strength followed, it confirmed the belief. When weakness appeared, it was attributed to fate, sin, or season. Because bodies are resilient, these dietary errors rarely caused immediate collapse, allowing them to persist softly through generations, woven into identity and culture. Weather patterns were interpreted in similar ways. A harsh winter was remembered not as a rare fluctuation, but as a sign, its cause explained through moral or cosmic reasoning rather than climate. Over time, people built expectations around these memories, preparing for conditions that might never repeat in the same way. When reality differed, it was folded back into the story, adjusted just enough to maintain coherence. The mind prefers continuity, and so memory bent rather than broke. Silence itself played a role in preserving these unnoticed mistakes. Many people sensed inconsistencies, but lacked the language or authority to articulate them. A farmer might notice that a particular planting method yielded less over time, but without a framework to explain why, he adjusted superficially rather than questioning the principle. A healer might sense that a treatment helped less than claimed, but the weight of tradition discouraged doubt. These private suspicions faded with the individuals who held them, never accumulating into collective correction. The pace of life ensured this fading. When days are filled with physical labour, when survival depends on repetition, reflection becomes a luxury. Errors thrive in busy worlds because they do not demand immediate attention. They ask only to be left alone, and the medieval world, busy with seasons, obligations, rituals, and survival, granted them that permission easily. Even joy was shaped by misunderstanding. Festivals celebrated events whose origins were long forgotten. Symbols used without awareness of their original meaning, yet the joy was real. The community strengthened, and so accuracy felt irrelevant. A mistaken origin does not weaken a shared song or a shared meal. In this way, errors became invisible, not because they lacked impact, but because their impact was positive enough to discourage investigation. As centuries layered themselves one upon another, these small inaccuracies fused into something stronger than truth. Familiarity. Familiarity is powerful. It does not argue, it reassures. It tells the mind that what is known is safe, that what is repeated is reliable. Medieval errors survived because they felt safe. They did not threaten the structure of daily life. They supported it, even if imperfectly. And now, as this reflection stretches on slow and steady, there is a gentle pull toward stillness. The medieval world hums softly, not with the noise of battles or plagues, but with the quiet persistence of everyday belief. Errors drift by like low clouds, never storming, never demanding attention. They simply exist, wrapped in trust, carried forward by hands that meant no harm. There is something profoundly human in that. We are not built to live in constant correction. We are built to live, to adapt, to accept what works well enough. The medieval past reminds us that being wrong is often less disruptive than being uncertain, and that certainty, even borrowed, allows rest. So the story does not conclude with revelation or correction. It fades instead, like candlelight dimming at the end of a long vigil. The errors remain unnoticed, doing what they always did, blending into life, supporting it just enough to keep it moving forward. And as the mind slows, as thoughts soften, it becomes clear that these medieval mistakes are not distant curiosities, but quiet ancestors of our own assumptions, resting beneath our certainties, waiting patiently, never in a hurry to be found. As the flow of this quiet history continues, it becomes clear that one of the deepest medieval errors was the belief that stability meant correctness. That if something endured long enough, it must be right. Endurance became evidence. A custom that survived a century felt truer than an idea that arrived yesterday, even if the new idea explained more. This belief wrapped itself around everything, from how children were raised to how elders were obeyed, from how land was divided to how suffering was explained. When something lasted, it earned trust simply by not collapsing, and so many flawed systems gained strength, not despite their errors, but because those errors were subtle enough to allow continuity. Silence again plays its quiet role here. Not just the silence of unspoken doubt, but the silence of those who never lived long enough to see long-term consequences. Many medieval errors unfolded slowly over decades or centuries, beyond the lifespan of any one person. Soil depletion, slow structural decay, creeping social inequality. These did not announce themselves dramatically. A farmer noticed slightly weaker harvests, but his father had survived worse, so he accepted it. A town noticed cracks in a wall, but the wall still stood, so concern faded. Because no single moment demanded alarm, no correction ever felt urgent. There was also the error of assuming intention where there was none. Random events were woven into meaningful patterns, not out of superstition alone, but out of a human need to feel oriented in the world. When tragedy struck, it felt safer to believe it happened for a reason than to accept chaos. that belief shaped decisions, rituals, and laws. And because it offered emotional shelter, it was rarely questioned. An explanation that comforts the heart can survive, even when it quietly misleads the mind. Travelers returning from distant lands carried stories that blurred truth and imagination, not because they meant to deceive, but because memory reshapes experience to fit expectation. Strange animals became larger, unfamiliar customs became extreme, unknown lands became simpler or more dangerous than they truly were. These stories filled gaps in collective knowledge, and once filled, the gaps rarely reopened. Few listeners had the means to verify them, and so the stories rested undisturbed, becoming part of how the wider world was understood, shaping fear, curiosity, and ambition in equal measure. Even craftsmanship, admired for its skill and beauty, carried inherited inefficiencies. A technique was considered masterful because it was difficult, not because it was optimal. Effort itself became proof of value. Easier methods, when discovered, were sometimes dismissed as inferior simply because they challenged the idea that mastery must involve struggle. And so labour continued in harder ways than necessary, not out of ignorance, but out of respect for tradition. The medieval world also carried a quiet era about progress itself. Change was often seen as decay rather than improvement, the present viewed as a shadow of a greater past. This belief inverted curiosity, turning innovation into suspicion. When something failed, the explanation often pointed backward, to forgotten purity or lost wisdom, rather than forward to adjustment or discovery. This orientation made error resilient, because correcting it felt like betrayal rather than growth. And yet, within all of this, life continued with warmth, laughter, love, and meaning. Children still played. Songs were still sung. People found joy within imperfect systems, and that joy acted like a soft blanket over deeper inaccuracies. When life feels full enough, few feel compelled to dismantle its foundations. As these thoughts drift on, there is a sense that medieval errors were not hidden because people were blind, but because they were busy being human. They worked, worried, hoped, endured. Precision was a luxury, survival was the priority, and so truth was shaped to serve life, rather than life reshaped to serve truth. This is what makes these errors so gentle to think about, especially in stillness. They do not accuse the past, they explain it. They remind us that knowledge grows not in straight lines, but in slow curves, looping back on itself, carrying old assumptions far into the future before finally letting them go. And as the medieval world slowly recedes again into shadow, its unnoticed mistakes remain behind like footprints in soft ground, gradually smoothed by time, never erased completely, but never sharp enough to wound. Just quiet impressions of how humans have always moved through uncertainty. Carefully, imperfectly, and often without ever realizing where the ground beneath them was slightly uneven. As this quiet meditation stretches onward, another gentle layer comes into view. The medieval tendency to confuse repetition with understanding. When something was done often enough, it felt understood even if no one could explain why it worked. Bells rang, fields were ploughed, prayers were spoken, remedies were mixed, and because these actions filled the days reliably. As the centuries stretch onward in the imagination, the medieval world begins to feel like a long, unbroken evening, where nothing ever fully resets, and because of that, small errors are rarely isolated events, but gentle accumulations stacking layer upon layer until they feel indistinguishable from reality itself. Think of how memory worked in such a world, not stored in books alone, but in people, and how fragile that made truth, because memory reshapes itself each time it is recalled, smoothing sharp edges, filling gaps with familiarity. A village remembers a famine, but not its cause. A kingdom remembers a victory, but not the lucky coincidence that made it possible. Over time, these memories harden into lessons, and those lessons guide decisions, even when their origins are flawed. No one questions them because they feel ancient, and age itself becomes proof of correctness. Even timekeeping, something we now consider precise and mechanical, drifted gently in medieval life. Bells rang to mark hours, but those hours stretched and shrank with the seasons, longer in summer, shorter in winter. And people adapted their bodies to this fluid rhythm. A meeting held at the third hour in one town might happen at a subtly different moment in another. Yet cooperation continued because expectation mattered more than exactness. When clocks eventually appeared, they were adjusted by eye, not calculation, often drifting day by day, yet no panic followed. Life bent around these inaccuracies, like grass around a stone, accommodating rather than resisting. Trad roots, too, were shaped by assumptions that went untested for generations. A road followed because it always had, even if a more efficient path existed nearby. A port flourished because it was believed to be safest, not because it truly was. Merchants accepted losses as the cost of fate, not realizing that better maps or measurements could have changed outcomes entirely. And because profit still flowed, even imperfectly, the system felt validated, allowing the underlying errors to remain comfortably asleep. In religion, one of the most powerful forces of medieval life, the weight of authority often outweighed observation. If a respected teacher said something was true, it carried more force than personal experience, especially when that experience was ambiguous or frightening. Natural phenomena were explained through inherited frameworks that made emotional sense even when they lacked physical accuracy. A comet became a warning, an illness, a test, a storm, a message. These interpretations shaped behavior and belief in deeply comforting ways, offering meaning where uncertainty might otherwise cause fear. And so, even when the explanations were wrong, they were useful, and usefulness protected them from scrutiny. The human body itself was misunderstood in ways that felt perfectly reasonable at the time. Without the ability to see inside, people relied on analogy and balance, imagining health as a harmony of invisible forces that needed constant adjustment. Treatments focused on restoring balance rather than addressing causes, and when someone improved, it confirmed the method. When they did not, the explanation shifted gently, never quite pointing back to the theory itself. This flexibility allowed errors to survive, not through rigidity, but through adaptability, bending just enough to avoid breaking. Communication delays further softened the edges of truth. News travelled slowly, arriving weeks or months after events occurred, often altered by distance alone. By the time a story reached its destination, it was already something new, shaped by the expectations of those who received it. Corrections, when they came at all, followed the same slow path, often arriving too late to matter. In such a world, being slightly wrong was not dangerous. Being confidently wrong was simply part of the landscape. Even emotions were guided by these unnoticed errors. Expectations about love, duty, honour, and fate shaped by stories and customs that had drifted over time. People loved whom they were told to love, feared what they were told to fear, accepted limits placed before them because those limits felt natural. Rarely did anyone stop to ask whether those boundaries were built on misunderstanding rather than necessity. And because most lives unfolded within those boundaries without catastrophe, the system felt stable, even kind. What emerges from all this is a picture not of ignorance, but of quiet sufficiency. The medieval world did not collapse under its mistakes, because most of them were small, slow, and survivable. They did not scream for attention. They whispered. They allowed people to wake, work, pray, eat, laugh, and sleep without interruption. And perhaps that is why they remained invisible for so long, because human attention is drawn to disruption, not continuity. As you let these thoughts drift together like overlapping echoes in a stone hall, there is a sense of calm in realizing that error does not always arrive as disaster. Sometimes it arrives as comfort, as explanation, as routine. Sometimes it becomes part of the furniture of the mind, so familiar that removing it would feel more disturbing than leaving it in place. The medieval world lived inside that familiarity, and in doing so, it teaches us something soft and enduring, that history is not only a record of what happened, but of what was believed to be happening. And that belief, even when wrong, can be powerful enough to carry an entire civilization gently through the night, never once waking it to ask whether the path beneath its feet was perfectly straight. If you continue to drift through this long medieval night, you begin to notice that many of these unnoticed errors were not just tolerated but quietly protected, because correcting them would have required disturbing the fragile calm that held communities together. Questioning an old belief was not merely an intellectual act, it was a social one, and social harmony mattered far more than precision. To say this might be wrong was often to say our fathers might have been mistaken, and that carried a weight few were willing to lift. So silence became a kind of agreement, and agreement slowly hardened into truth. In this way, errors were not hidden. They were gently wrapped in respect and left untouched. Even curiosity itself had boundaries shaped by misunderstanding. People wondered about the world deeply, but within frameworks that had already been accepted. Questions were asked, but only in directions that felt safe. Why does the sun move this way? Because it must. Why does illness strike some and not others? Because balance has been lost. These answers were not lazy. They were soothing. They closed the loop quickly, allowing the mind to rest rather than wander endlessly into uncertainty. In a life already filled with physical hardship, emotional reassurance mattered more than abstract correctness. The environment played along with this quiet agreement. Nature rarely contradicted beliefs in obvious ways. Crops still grew even when agricultural theories were incomplete. Rivers still flowed even when their sources were misidentified. The stars still followed patterns even if the explanations behind them were tangled. Because the world functioned well enough, its deeper inaccuracies stayed submerged, like stones beneath calm water. You only noticed them if you stopped moving and looked closely, and medieval life rarely allowed for that kind of stillness. Power structures also benefited from these unnoticed errors. Authority thrives on continuity, and continuity thrives on unquestioned assumptions. A ruler justified by lineage did not need that lineage to be perfectly accurate. It only needed to be believed. A law justified by tradition did not need to be logical. It only needed to feel old. Over time, these justifications became self-reinforcing, and any cracks were smoothed over by ritual and ceremony. The error was not a flaw in the system. It was part of the glue holding it together. Even fear itself was shaped by gentle misunderstandings. People feared eclipses, strange births, sudden storms, not because they were irrational, but because the explanations available to them framed these events as meaningful disruptions. And fear, when shared, becomes manageable. It creates community, shared prayer, shared vigilance. In that sense, even wrong explanations served a purpose, transforming chaos into narrative. The cost was accuracy, but the reward was emotional order, and that trade felt reasonable. As generations passed, children inherited not just land and names, but assumptions. They learned how the world worked before they were old enough to question it. And by the time doubt might have arisen, life had already settled into patterns that felt too solid to disturb. Marriage customs, gender roles, ideas of destiny and limitation, all were shaped by interpretations layered so thickly over time that their original logic was no longer visible. They felt natural, inevitable, like the shape of the hills. What is striking is how little resistance there was to these slow drifts. Change, when it came, arrived quietly, almost apologetically. A new idea was framed as a rediscovery, not a correction. A contradiction was explained as a deeper truth, rather than an error. In this way, the medieval world could evolve without ever admitting it had been wrong. Continuity was preserved, and sleep remained undisturbed. And perhaps the most human of all these unnoticed errors was the belief that the present moment represented completion. Each generation felt in its own way that the world now made sense, that the major questions had been answered, that what remained was detail. This belief is not unique to the medieval past. It echoes softly into every age. It is comforting to think that uncertainty lies behind us rather than ahead, that we are standing on solid,